My name is Victoria, and this is my story. Growing up, I was always compared to my older sister. Everyone would be like, oh, well, if only she just had like your personality, like she would be perfect. But if you had her body, it would make you even more perfect. And so I was always being compared, and it made me hate the way I looked. Like I hated looking in the mirror, I hated trying on clothes, I would hate going shopping because I didn't want to go get outfits because my sister, she would always look better in them. Because of that, I ended up starting an eating disorder. Every time I would eat, I would go throw it up, or whenever I would get angry, I would eat and then just throw it up, or if I just felt so bad, I just wouldn't eat at all. It was miserable. It got so bad to where like whenever I would eat my food, I couldn't even digest it. I would look pale, I would be sick all the time, I would constantly be like shaking and hurting. My fingers, they would like turn purple, and I have scars on my fingers from the acid because of sticking my fingers down my throat. I went to my parents one day because I could barely like move, I could barely get out of bed. I was so weak and so fragile, and I told them, I was like, I can't get rid of this on my own, I can't stop this on my own, I need help. And so they're like, okay. So we ended up going to a rehab facility for eating disorders and depression and suicide. An eating disorder, it's not just a problem, it's more like an addiction. So after I got out of rehab, I went back to school. Going back to school was so hard because my friends, they knew where I was, they knew I was in rehab for an eating disorder, and it was like they couldn't remember who I was before I went in. Like they couldn't remember how I was their friend. So they defined me with my eating disorders, and they didn't know how to react. I was back to being alone, but the only friends that would hang out with me were the ones that were crazy drugs. That's how I got into drugs. My parents ended up finding the billboard for Oasis Church. And so they're like, hey, we went and checked out this church, and we think you'd really like it. It's a really good church. And so I was like, okay, I'll go. So I went. So I ended up going to church camp with them, and I didn't really know anybody still, but by the end of the week, like I knew everybody. I was a completely different person. Like I was just like, okay, I'm gonna go back home, I'm gonna change. Before I knew it, I stopped going to church, and that fire that I once had, and that joy that I once had, that comfort that I once had, it all went away because I didn't put my trust in Him. I started experimenting with even harder drugs. I became addicted to cocaine on top of what I was already doing, on top of the ecstasy, on top of the weed, on top of my eating disorder. Everything was getting piled up. I would be at clubs dancing with guys that I didn't even know, and before I knew it, I was going home with those guys that I had no idea, I didn't even know their name. And I would go home with them and wake up realizing what I had just done, feeling disgusted, feeling horrible with myself. And then I would go and do the exact same thing over and over again. One day I got news that a good friend of mine had passed and that he was my age. And all I can remember from his funeral was everyone talking about how much he loved God, how much he loved Jesus. And so I realized the lifestyle that I was living, it wasn't right. And I didn't have that happiness that he had. I didn't have that passion for life that he had, but I wanted it. And I remember the last place that I got that was at Oasis. I'm no longer the same person that had those addictions. I don't have to run to drugs. I don't have to run to men. I don't have to run to alcohol. I don't have to run to friends to find my identity. I found my identity, and it's in Christ. And this is my story. What's your story?